So, what if an idea's greatest strength was also its fatal flaw? Well, that's exactly what we're going to get into today. We're diving into one of the most profound paradoxes in modern philosophy, from none other than Friedrich Nietzsche. It's his explosive argument that Christianity's highest virtue, its absolute devotion to truth, was the very thing that ended up destroying it from the inside. I mean, just think about that for a second. It's a pretty wild question, right? And it's the central puzzle we're going to try and solve. How could the relentless search for truth, something that a religion itself champions, become the very weapon that dismantles it piece by piece? Okay, so to really wrap our heads around this, we have to start at the beginning, with how this intense demand for truth was even created. Nietzsche argues it all kicks off with what he calls the paradox of pious honesty. So, how did this whole thing start? Well, Nietzsche argues that for hundreds of years, Christian discipline basically acted like a boot camp for the European mind. It drilled one powerful value into people above all else: truth. And this wasn't just some abstract idea, it was a divine command, a moral duty. This intense training actually built something inside people. And that something is what Nietzsche famously calls the intellectual conscience. You can think of it as this little incorruptible judge sitting inside your head. It's that voice that just refuses to let you get away with comforting lies. It demands cold, hard evidence for everything you believe, especially for the beliefs you hold most dear. And right here, this is where the story takes a massive dramatic turn. Because that highly trained conscience, the one forged in the fires of religious piety, doesn't just look out at the world. Eventually, it starts to turn inward. The very tool used to understand God becomes a weapon of inquiry aimed squarely at God. You see, the principle that faith had pushed for centuries, that truth is a divine value, was suddenly flipped back on itself. The new demand became, okay, if truth is really the highest value, then faith itself has to stand up to that same ruthless scrutiny. It's like turning a telescope around to look at your own eye. And here's the thing, once this intellectual conscience is switched on, you just can't switch it off. It starts to relentlessly pull apart the very foundations of belief. Suddenly, logical inconsistencies can't be explained away. Historical gaps can't just be ignored. Supernatural claims, well, now they need evidence, not just blind acceptance. And most importantly, what Nietzsche called holy lies, those comforting stories that make us feel good, they become forbidden. Now, all of this leads us to one of the most famous and most misunderstood phrases in all of philosophy, the death of God. But for Nietzsche, this wasn't some attack from the outside by a bunch of atheists. No, this was an internal collapse, a domestic murder, as he put it, committed by believers who simply took truth too seriously. And this iconic quote, you have to understand, it's not some triumphant cheer. Nietzsche writes it as a cry of absolute shock and horror. And the we, the you and I who killed him, it's not the enemies of faith, it's the pious ones, the deep thinkers, the ones who follow that demand for truth all the way to its brutal, devastating end. So, of course, this murder is a metaphor. It represents this huge collective shift in humanity. It's that dawning moment of realization, driven by that unstoppable intellectual conscience, that our entire moral and cosmic framework, it wasn't handed down from on high. It was man-made. It was a projection of our own hopes and fears onto a vast, silent cosmos. So, what happens when that cosmic safety net is gone? When the projection screen goes dark? Well, the result is absolutely terrifying. This is the fallout from the truth, the feeling of being completely and utterly exposed, just naked in the cosmos. Without God, the traditional why for our existence, it just vanishes. And that leaves a vacuum, a terrifying void that risks plunging us into total nihilism, where nothing matters at all. Nietzsche called it a state of cosmic homelessness. We're adrift, with no direction, and none of the old comforting superstitions to protect us from the silence of the universe. It's a tragedy that we are now, for the first time, fully aware of. But, and this is the classic Nietzschean twist, he doesn't see this terror as the end of the line. For him, this wasn't just a catastrophe. It was a painful but totally necessary cleansing. It's like clearing out all the old, dusty cobwebs of a decaying civilization to finally make room for something new. And that brings us to the final and maybe the most thrilling part of Nietzsche's whole vision. He shows us how this deep, profound tragedy can actually be transformed into an incredible, unprecedented liberation. He kind of lays out this psychological journey in 3 stages. First, you've got deconstruction. That's our intellectual conscience taking a wrecking ball to the old beliefs. That, of course, leads to the second stage, despair. That's the feeling of being homeless and alone in the universe. But if you can push through that, you get to the final and most important stage, creation. The human spirit is finally free, truly liberated to invent its own meaning, its own values. So the death of God isn't just a loss. It's the opening of a brand new sea, a vast, uncharted ocean. And we are now the explorers, free to navigate without some pre-drawn map handed to us by a creator. And that's the great transformation, right there. The terror of being lost becomes the absolute thrill of discovery. So what did we trade? We lost cosmic certainty, sure, but we gained an unbelievable amount of freedom. We traded blind faith for a reality that we get to define ourselves. We swapped out the heavy weight of divine judgment for the limitless power of human creativity. It's a huge trade-off, but for Nietzsche, it's worth it. And this, really, is the ultimate point. For Nietzsche, the death of God is not a failure. It's actually a sign of humanity finally growing up. It's the greatest victory of that intellectual conscience, proving that we are, at last, strong enough to look the truth right in the eye and create our own purpose in its wake. So it leaves us with this really profound and personal question. If the old maps are gone and we're all standing at the shore of this new open sea, what comes next is entirely up to us. What new worlds will you choose to discover?